community about the campaign finance reform. Today, this evening, I'm really happy to gather everybody together, both here and online, to talk about the candidates for Attorney General and to hopefully help educate voters to make a very smart, informed decision about who will make the best Attorney General for the District of Columbia. So let me turn the program over to the founding director of the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History, former Mayor Sharon Pratt.
Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to join with our Dean, Renee Hutchins, who does such a brilliant job, Ward 3 and Ward 4 Democrats who have agreed and appropriately hosting this wonderful panel of these very talented candidates. Just also to reinforce that I am a part of the Institute of Politics, Policy, and History. Well, I have an audience, I'm going to tell you that, which is on the campus of the University of the District of Columbia, and it has a very special mission, one of which is to deal with some of the consequential issues of our day, which has everything to do with the second mission, to explore and rediscover the history of Washington, D.C., because most people don't know very much about us beyond the monuments in the city. And we are a community which is often overlooked, and that history about why the founding fathers chose this money nothingness to make it the capital. It's quite a story, not necessarily flattering to our founding fathers, but we still love them. With that, I am delighted to be a part of this great forum to introduce our dean and to also be a part of introducing our candidates. I am a native of the city. I grew up in this city. I grew up with the frustration of not being respected as a local resident and having others always dictate to us. So I look forward to hearing from these candidates and hopefully hearing that they each have a mission that says they will respect the one and only authority that matters, or ought to matter, and that is we the people of what soon will be the Douglas Commonwealth. There is no other authority than that. Thank you.
All right, am I in the right position now? Okay, perfect. Thank you, Acting Chair Dr. Zuckerstein, sorry, and thank you, Mayor Pratt. Good evening, everyone. As Mayor Pratt indicated, I am Renee Hutchins, and I am this evening's moderator. I also have the distinct privilege of serving as the Dean of the remarkable institution that you are now sitting in, the University of the District of Columbia's David A. Clark School of Law. We are the nation. We are the only public HBCU law school in the nation's capital, and we tout a number 5 in the nation clinical law program, which ranks us on par with Yale's clinical law program. I want to welcome you to tonight's Attorney General Candidates Forum. Tonight's event is being sponsored by the Ward 3 and Ward 4 Democrats and the University of the District of Columbia, which is our parent institution, and which is also the public institution of higher learning for our nation's capital. So the point of this forum is to provide voters with as much information as possible. Tonight we are joined by the 4 candidates, Ryan Jones, Kenyon McDuffie, Brian Schwab, and Bruce Spivey. Prior to the debate, prior to the debate, the order of presentation was randomly selected. So Kenyon McDuffie will go first, Brian Schwab will go second, Ryan Jones will go third, and Bruce Spivey will go fourth for opening statements and for the first question. I'd like to explain some of the rules of the road. We are going to begin with opening statements from each candidate. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to make an opening. We will then move to an hour of Q&A, where I will ask a series of questions related to topics of general interest. In the randomly selected order that I just announced, we will hear from each candidate. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to answer their questions. If I ask a related follow-up, the candidate will have 1.5 minutes to provide the answer. There is a timekeeper sitting in the front row. Candidates, the timekeeper is going to hold up a green paper to indicate that your time has begun, a yellow paper to indicate that you have 15 seconds remaining, and a red paper to indicate that your time has expired. Please do not make me use my teacher voice. Please honor the time flags. At the conclusion of the 1-hour Q&A, each candidate will be given 2 minutes to provide a closing in the reverse order of the openings, and then we will close out the evening. So at this point, I will turn it over to opening statements. Mr. McDuffie, you are first. They should be. They were.
You all hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. You can?
Yeah. Yes.
Perfect. All right. My name is Kenyon McDuffie. I represent Ward 5 of the Council of the District of Columbia, and I'm running to be your next Attorney General. I'm running to ensure that justice, opportunity, and equity reach every person in every corner of our city. I ran for Ward 5 Council because I wanted to fight to make sure that justice, opportunity, and equity were centered in the legislative efforts of the District of Columbia. And I went to law school in order to help my community, to use the law as a tool to serve the residents. I've spent my career in public service. In fact, my career is slightly unconventional. Not too far from here, I graduated from high school in 1993 at the former Woodrow Wilson High School, now Jackson Reed. And when I went to college, I went to UDC. And when I transferred to Howard University and graduated, I chose to serve. I chose to work on the staff of Delegate Ellen Holmes Norton in order to serve the residents of the District of Columbia. When I graduated from law school at the University of Maryland, I was a prosecutor. And before that, I was a law clerk to a judge who was the juvenile judge in charge. I went to the Department of Justice after serving as an assistant state's attorney in the Civil Rights Division. And then I ran for office. Every step of my legal career, I have chose to serve. And for the last 10 years, I've been serving the residents of the District of Columbia. And as your Attorney General, I'm going to fight to make sure we ensure public safety and that you are a part of the solutions to keeping the community safe. I'm going to make sure we tackle issues around consumer protection and wage theft and make sure that the office is more community facing. I appreciate the invitation to participate in tonight's forum, and I look forward to telling you why I am uniquely qualified to be the next Attorney General of the District of Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. McDuffie. Mr. Schwab.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Ward 3 and 4 Democrats. I'm Brian Schwab. I'm a third-generation Washingtonian. I was born here. My mother was born here. My grandfather was born here. My 3 daughters were born here, fourth-generation Washingtonian. After finishing law school and a clerkship in Baltimore, I came back to join the Justice Department during the Clinton administration. My wife, Mickey, and I have lived in the same house for the last 30 years. Washington has been an amazing city for us to live in, to build a family in, and for me to practice law in for the last 30 years. My dad gave me a lot of good advice before he died, and one piece of advice was God gives us 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We should always be listening twice as much as we talk. And that's what I've been doing over the course of this campaign, is listening to people all over the city. And what I hear from people, every part of the city, is that people are proud to be Washingtonians. They love our city. They love the beauty of our city, our parks, our rivers. They love the museums and the culture, our sports teams. They love that important work is being done in Washington, that people come to Washington to do important work. We're a magnet for talent. We are awash in resources. We do not lack for resources in Washington. What we have is not a resource problem. We have a resource distribution problem. We don't share opportunity and equity and income fairly across the city. And for all of us who love Washington, that to me is the single biggest threat to our collective future. And the law, in my view, is the single most powerful tool we have to do something about that. The law is a tool like a shovel. You put a shovel in some people's hands and they use it to bang people over the head or to dig holes deeper than they already are. And for some, a shovel is used to cultivate the earth and help things grow. We're making a decision as Washingtonians to elect the next Attorney General. We're deciding whose hands are we going to put that tool of the law into whose hands are we entrusting it. I'm proud that our current Attorney General, Carl Racine, the first elected Attorney General, has endorsed me. And I'm looking forward to talking with you all this evening about what I hope to bring as your next Attorney General.
Thank you very much. Mr. Jones.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Ryan Jones. I'm running for Attorney General for the District of Columbia. I'm from Washington, D.C., son of Denise Champion and Lawrence Jones. Went to St. John's College High School. Played basketball in college at Elon and then Stony Brook. Played a little bit afterwards and returned back to D.C., where I started working at the Wick State Agency. That's the Office of Women's Infants and Children. I did outreach there. At that point, I decided to go to law school. I went to Southern Illinois and graduated in 2.5 years. I mention that always to show my work ethic. After that, came back to DC, realized I wanted to expand my legal education, and went to George Washington University School of Law and received my LLM in intellectual property. During the same time I was doing that, I started a law firm in order to help a friend of mine who was confronted with fraud matters. And I took on that case, and that case propelled into other things. I ended up helping friends and family members, and that put me in the Court of Appeals. And it's grown my practice to where it is today, where I've been practicing routinely. I've been in the United States District Court with several clients, international clients, some of the largest retailers I've represented. I filed cases against some of the largest media conglomerates and sneaker manufacturers, holding people accountable on behalf of workers and nonprofits. I've worked hard, and 2020 revealed that we need new leadership. We need a new vision to put us in a place where equality is a reality. I'm saying to you as Attorney General, I'll be able to close the disparities that exist and lead us into a brighter future, which we all deserve. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion today.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Spiva.
Good evening. My name is Bruce Spiva, and I'm running for DC Attorney General. For the last 30 years, my wife Anna and I have been here, and Washington, DC has been our home. We've raised our 2 sons here. We love this city, and we really want to continue to fight to make it better, especially for those who've been left out and left behind. I've also been practicing law for 30 years. And I've never forgotten that I stand on the shoulders of others, most prominently my mother and my late father, who both grew up in the Jim Crow era South, and both went on to lives of service to others. My father graduated from another HBCU, Tennessee State, in 1954, the year that the Brown versus Board of Education decision was decided. And he believed strongly in the power of the law to make our lives better, particularly minority folks. He's the one who inspired me to go to law school, and he instilled in me a sense of duty and courage to fight for change. And that's what I've been doing these past 30 years. As a civil rights lawyer, I've taken on the tough battles and won. I fought for low-income residents of Columbia Heights, African American, Asian, Latino, who were thrown out of their house by the district government itself and the slumlords who let their properties run down. They were riding on city buses at night with children looking for a place to stay. We sued and we recovered money damages on behalf of those people for the trauma that they suffered. I fought on behalf of a Howard University freshman who was sexually assaulted and drugged at an off-campus party, and then her case was badly mishandled by the MPD. And her mother said something to me that I'll never forget. That sometimes when you're in a tough fight and you feel like things are going against you, that sometimes just having somebody on your side makes all the difference. I want to be Attorney General because I want to fight for you, and I look forward to your questions tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the first set of questions that I'm going to ask you about relate to crime. And the first question will impact directly those of us who were in this building last Friday. So the immediate community has experienced 2 violent crimes in the past week. The shooting on Friday had a shelter place in this building for several hours. and resulted in a number of injuries. Ms. Mcduffie, I will ask you first, in your view, what has led to the increase in violence and how would you address it?
Thank you for the question, Dean. So I chaired the Committee on Judiciary of the Council at a time when our community was seeing a spike in violence, in particular gun violence. As a result, I scoured the country looking for evidence-based, data-driven solutions to do something different. I spoke with experts like epidemiologist Dr. Gary Slutkin, who had started the Cure Violence Model out of Chicago. I spoke to Devon Bogan, who had created the Office of Neighborhood Safety in Richmond, California, where they'd seen a decrease in homicides of 70% a year. I spoke to people like our chief medical examiner, Dr. Roger Mitchell, who's an expert on violence prevention. And I brought all those experts to the table. I brought people like you to the table. And I brought academics from around our city to come up with the NEAR Act, the Neighborhood Engagement and Chief Results Act. It is 20 titles and subtitles of evidence-based, data-driven solutions to address gun violence. What I think has led to the violence that we're seeing is, in some cases, an absence of hope and opportunity in communities that have too long have faced violence. But we've seen high incidence of poverty, unemployment, right? And it's also a combination of making sure we're working better with our public safety partners, federal and local, on a coordinated effort to keep people safe in this community and communities across the District of Columbia, communities that I know well. I didn't just show up at this law school today and ask for your vote. I was here when we were working on solutions to address slumlords who were unjustly evicting their tenants, and held a forum right here in a roundtable and came up with the Access to Justice bill that funds lawyers for tenants who are facing unjust evictions.
Thank you, Mr. McDuffie.
Thank you, Dean.
Mr. Schwab.
Thank you. So I was speaking recently with a woman named Brenda about her experiences living in DC. I shared with her that my wife, Mickey, and I had lived in our house for 30 years. And she told me she had lived in the same house for 30 years too, but she didn't own the house. She rented it. She asked me what I thought her dream for that house might be. I thought she was going to tell me she hoped one day to be able to own the house. But what she told me took my breath away. She said to me, I hope one day I can walk around the block and feel safe. For too many people who've lived in Washington, D.C., the ability to walk in our neighborhoods and feel safe has been something that has been elusive. And only recently has that fear of gun violence spread more across the entire city. I believe the concept of a neighbor and a neighborhood is a moral concept as much as it is a geographic one. And what we're experiencing right now is the fact that gun violence is up across the city and people are taking note of it. What happened here last week was a tragedy, but it could have been so much worse. Thank goodness it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Guns are prevalent. It is way too easy to get a gun in Washington, D.C. We're awash in guns. I don't think we can arrest and prosecute our way out of the number of guns we have. It would completely end the system working. So we have to focus on how do we keep people away from guns. We have to aggressively deal with people who are handling guns and doing crimes with guns by holding people accountable. Our criminal justice system has to work. We have to close cases in cooperation with MPD, with admissible evidence, constitutionally acquired evidence, so that people know there are consequences to behavior when people are getting hurt. When we're talking about juvenile justice, which is what the Attorney General is responsible for, we have to make sure when kids are facing consequences, they're given resources so that they rehabilitate, because that's what our criminal justice system is committed to. And we make ourselves safer as a community when we do invest in kids so that they don't recidivate. The gun violence issue is one that we need to work with our partners, federal and Maryland and Virginia. It's an interjurisdictional issue. And I'll talk more about gun violence because I'm sure we're going to have time to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
Yes, so DC, like the rest of the country, has a violence problem. And I believe we specifically need to attack having guns on our streets with the buyback program. We need to ensure that we're protecting our folks with bringing in lawsuits against manufacturers of guns who ship parts into the city that then are assembled here that create these illegal ghost guns. We hold these manufacturers accountable. they're disincentivized to shipping those parts here, then we keep people from assembling guns here in DC and then using them in streets that we all want to feel safe in. We're talking.
Just put your mic a little bit closer. It's difficult. Thank you. Sorry about that. You will get the extra time.
We need to continue to infuse funding into programs like Cure the Streets and expand it a bit more so that our young aren't participating in these types of acts. Programs like and nonprofits like Ceasefire, Don't Smoke, the Brothers and Sisters. I grew up 2 blocks from there, and I know how essential their work has been in my life and people's lives that I've known. And as well, I believe that we have to catch young folks early. There's programs like Birth to 3. We're talking about teaching differently how to act in society, knowing that we can't use violence as an answer. We have to have better remedies. And so we're talking about a cultural change. And that's what I would like to do as Attorney General for the District of Columbia, as well as working with council, the mayor, and the various police departments that we have in Washington, D.C. to keep guns off our street. We have all kinds of police departments here, park services, Secret Service, MPD. We have the resources. We need to execute.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Spiva.
Thank you. I definitely understand the concern and the fear. I have 2, they're now young adults, young Black men who drive cars and are out sometimes at night, and we're wondering, are they going to come back safe to us? Whether they might have an encounter with the police potentially that goes wrong, or an encounter with somebody with a gun. And so I definitely understand the concern and the fear, and I think it's a multifaceted problem. The issue here in Van Ness, last week, we don't know. I don't think all the answers yet, but it certainly appears to be a mental health issue. We certainly have a mental health crisis in our city, in our nation, and we need to address that mental health issue and provide mental health counseling, particularly for our youth, which is the province, as Attorney Schwab stated, of the DC Attorney General's office, try to keep them out of trouble in the first place. And if they get into trouble, to try to get them back on the right track. We have a gun problem. It's too easy to get a gun. It's too hard to keep them out of the wrong hands, such as the person who had miniguns last week. We need better red flag laws and enforcement of those laws. Unfortunately, we're up against some obstacles. The NRA has some of the best lobbyists in the history of time. And so we need federal solutions as well. And I certainly would be a fierce advocate for that as Attorney General, even though it's not strictly within the province of the office, but it's a necessary part of the solution. I think we have to look at root causes of crime. We have to look at mental health. We have to look at substance abuse counseling. We have to look at better circumstances for our young to keep them out of trouble. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Spiva. So my follow-up question is going to go to you first, and then I'm going to take it in reverse order. So in response to the last question, several of you mentioned the Metropolitan Police Department. The mayor has suggested increasing the number of Metropolitan Police Department officers from 3,500 to 4,000. I'd like you to talk a little bit about whether you support that plan, and if you do, why.
Yeah, I think it's arbitrary to say, like, we're going to add X number of officers. I'm certainly not a defund the police person. I think we need to have enough officers to protect us. We've had 2 excellent reports on police reform and on criminal justice reform in the last 2 years, with a number of very good ideas to try to reduce the crime rate, which would ultimately, I think, reduce the need for the number and the spending on police. My view is that in the here and now, we need to fund the number of police we have, but we also need to fund these other ideas in these reports. Ideas like fully funding mental health counseling, hiring behavioral health specialists so that we don't always send the police in the first instance to respond to what is actually a behavioral health crisis. Maybe in some instances, as the reports set forth, there might be a co-response where you have somebody with a weapon, but who's truly going through a behavioral health, mental health crisis. And those types of ideas need to be funded. It's not an either or, though. I think it's a false dichotomy to say either we hire police or we hire the mental health specialists and we do economic justice and we try to do something about housing instability, which leads to trauma among our kids. And we try to do something about the violence that is causing so many of them to turn to violence themselves because they've been traumatized. I always say hurt people often end up hurting the people. And so we need to do all of that. I think in the end, if we do those things, we will be safer and we'll have a better society and we probably will need fewer police. But I'm certainly not one who advocates for reducing the police force until we get to that day.
Thank you, Mr. Spiva. Mr. Jones, the same question.
Right. So I think the numbers, as put forth by the mayor, cover the attrition in the police force. And right now, there is a spike in crime and an acute, response. You did need to beef up the police force, right? People need to feel safe. And right now, that's what we have as an answer. And so long-term changes to how police is necessary as well. And I look forward to that. But right now, COVID exacerbated despair and ramped up crime. And how do we stand that down? And so if this is what our leadership has determined to do that best, I think it's wise to support it. And at the same time, start looking at long-term solutions such as what Mr. Spiva has recommended. We need to recognize today that violence isn't a reality, but that's by changing programs. That's by removing the despair that we experience in too many corners of the city. And so for right now, I do agree with you, but we need a better way moving forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schwab.
Well, I'm not a politician. I'm a first-time candidate. I spent the last 30 years practicing law. I feel like crime gets politicized right around election time. And that's unfortunate for all of us who live in DC. I don't know what the right number is. I respect Chief Conte and the mayor, but I also know that we called for a detailed study back in 2017 to understand why we have more per capita police in Washington, DC than any other major metropolitan area. And how efficient is our police department working? I believe in evidence and data and following what that teaches us rather than guessing at a number. I don't know what the number is, and candidly, until we do that work, I don't know how anybody knows what the number is. I do know we need our police. We need our police to show up. We call them when we don't feel safe, and they're part of a comprehensive program to dealing with what we all deserve to feel in this city, which is to feel safe in our neighborhoods. When we don't feel safe, everything else about how we aspire to be the great city we want to be falls apart. I have a 6-point action plan about how we deal with crime and safety right now. It requires us to do two things at the same time: address crime now and prevent crime from happening in the future. How do we address crime now? Well, as a prosecutor, we close cases. We hold people accountable by making sure that when there are repeat violent offenders, they know that our court system is going to work. And we work with our police in community policing in an effort so that our police are playing a productive role with partners, mental health, substance abuse, domestic violence experts who can come and de-escalate. And I'll tell you about the other part of my plan if I get some time later.
Thank you, Mr. Schwab. Mr. Mcduffie.
So I appreciate the question, but I disagree with the premise of the question when it comes to these arbitrary numbers about how many police there should be. And I think if you look at the history of the Metropolitan Police Department, when you had some of the highest numbers of police, you also had some of the highest rates of crime and violence. What we need are two things: accountability and opportunity. You need accountability when somebody commits a crime to make sure that there are consequences. And law enforcement is an essential component of making sure the criminal justice system functions in a way that there's accountability, both for the public at large and for the victims who experience it. But you also need opportunity. You need opportunity for those people who are committing the crimes, the people in the communities who are left, because at the end of the day, particularly when it comes to gun violence, there's a handful of people who are committing gun violence throughout the District of Columbia. The lion's share of our public are honest, law-abiding citizens trying to figure out how to make it ends meet. You need opportunity so that those folks who are in communities that are plagued by violence and have been for years see a pathway to success that does not include violence. And when you hear people running for this office or any other office talk about mental health workers with police and vetting them there, restorative justice for juvenile justice, for juveniles, keeping them out of the juvenile justice system, when you hear about them talking about a public health-based approach to crime prevention, those are bills that are already authored, passed, and funded. So I'm asking for an opportunity to implement them as the next Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Mcduffie. So the next question is going to relate to a related topic, which is juvenile justice. Mr. Jones, I'm going to ask you to talk about this issue first. So, desire to keep juvenile offenders out of prison and in the community can sometimes bump up against residents' desire to feel safe. Can you talk a little bit about how you balance those two, perhaps competing goals?
So I understand Washington, D.C. has a gold standard for restorative justice, especially for deterring folks from getting into the criminal justice system so they're not on the margins of society, which push them into a life of crime, which exacerbates or makes more harsh their life, that then we all experience those who aren't in that on the margins. So I think we need to learn on a case-by-case basis who would benefit from, deferments, who would benefit from having the opportunity to have that restorative justice program work in their favor. We need to analyze that and see which people would be best for it. And so if you know that we're doing the hard work, we're working on each and every one of these young folks who come to the door, and we're putting that time in and we're making the analysis correctly, then people can feel safe. Then these items don't clash, because that allows for you all to know that we're doing the hard work. We're not passing it off to somebody else. We're not lazy about it. We're active about it. And when we start seeing the data in the favor of, having deferments, then you can feel confident in what we're doing is working.
Thank you very much. Mr. Spiva, the same question to you. How would you balance the competing goals?
Sure. I think that we have to recognize that once a juvenile is in the juvenile justice system, that at many levels we've already failed, because if we were doing all that we should be doing to provide the mental health counseling and the economic opportunity and the excellent schooling, many fewer of them would ever get involved in the system in the first place, and we'd be safer. Once they are involved in the system, it's my view that we still want to provide those types of wraparound services to get them back on the right track. I think we want to avoid incarceration where we can for lower level offenses. Some things probably shouldn't be offenses at all, such as low level possession of marijuana. And there are things that happen in the white side of town, predominantly white side of town, that result at worst in a trip to the principal's office. But if they happen in the black and brown side of town, they result in an arrest, and that needs to stop. We need to end the school to prison pipeline. I'm not naive. I understand there are serious crimes being committed by some of our children, and I consciously call them our children because they are all our children. There needs to be accountability, yes, but even with respect to the serious crimes, the failure is ours too, and we will not be safe until we address these root causes. That will make us safer. I'm against, in almost all instances, sending children into adult prisons. There may be instances where we need to hold them longer in a non-adult facility to continue that process of helping them get back on the right track. But they're going to come out again someday, and sending them out into an adult prison to be re-traumatized is not going to make us safer. So that's right, how I would counsel.
Mr. McDuffie.
Thank you. I don't think that those two goals have to be competing. Right. I think we should be able to hold young people who commit crimes accountable in a way that focuses on rehabilitation and age-appropriate consequences, but at the same time recognizing the need for the programs that will keep them from recidivating. And I think it's important to recognize the need to put resources in place for those young people and the young people in their community before they enter the system, which is why, as chair of the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety, I introduced comprehensive juvenile justice reform and work with people, more than 30 organizations and academics and residents across the District of Columbia to do things like prevent children from entering the criminal justice system to begin with. It expanded oversight of services with the agencies that have jurisdiction over these young folks who enter the system. It made sure that they were coordinating data and sharing data for the people who were responsible for trying to successfully rehabilitate them. It also provided age-appropriate sentences, making sure that we weren't, we were ending the indiscriminate shackling of young folks who entered family court. Working alongside my current Attorney General and my former colleague, David Grosso. These are the things that I did with comprehensive juvenile justice reform. It reduced over-incarceration, protected children from some of the status offenses that we saw had them enter the system so often to begin with. It also made sure that it improved the conditions of confinement once they were in the system, so that it wasn't just strictly punitive, that it focused on rehabilitation. So I don't think the two goals are mutually exclusive. I think that we can hold young people accountable for their actions, while also making sure we focus on diversion programs and successful reintegration.
Thank you, Mr. McDuffie. Mr. Schwab, I'll ask you for a hand. I'm going to ask the audience to please hold applause and outbursts so that we can get as much information as possible during the time that we have. Mr. Schwab.
Okay, thank you, Dean. So I've had the great privilege of being a mentor to a young man named Deontay. Deontay, when he was 15 years old, was shot in the neck. He was paralyzed for 18 months. For 18 months, he worked hard to get use of his legs and his arms back. He's got full use of his legs now. His left arm, he still struggles with. But Deontay's going to graduate with a degree from Morehouse on May 15th in business. I'm incredibly proud of him and what he's been able to overcome. But I was at the Wizards game with him over the winter break, and I said, Deontay, can you share with me a little bit of wisdom as to why kids are shooting at each other? And what he said to me was, Brian, we don't know how to use our words. I stopped, I thought, wow, think about the wisdom of that 21-year-old man. We don't know how to use our words. When my wife, Mickey, and I and had girls that were growing up and they started to temper tantrum, parents talked to their kids about, you got to use your words. And we have coaches and teachers and guidance counselors who talk about resolving disagreements without resorting to violence. But what Deontay said was, because we don't know how to use our words, we're fighting with each other. And because guns are prolific and available everywhere, we're shooting at each other. Deontay also said he was lucky that he was paralyzed. He thought it was a blessing, because had he not been paralyzed, had he been shot and patched up and went out there, one of two things was going to happen. He was going to retaliate and be locked up, or he was going to get killed. When we talk about investing in kids, the other part of my 6-point action plan, it's talking about investing in kids before they get near the criminal justice system. It's focusing on those root causes by keeping kids away from the criminal justice system with an eye towards what are they going to do in their lives that they're good at, that they feel great about, that leads them to a goal of saying, I can have a productive life. For some kids, it's like Deontay, they want to go to 4-year colleges. For other kids, they need vocational education and training and workforce so that they can see a way to make a living and having a prosperous life. We need to make sure that we treat our kids as kids. Their brains are developing. We need to invest in them. And I'm never going to give up on kids in the District of Columbia as your next Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Schwab. So we're going to pivot now from crime and juvenile justice to housing. And I will ask you, Mr. Schwab, actually to lead us off. So what should the next AG do to address what is going to be a pending crisis?
Well, I think we have to realize that one of the great assets we have in the District of Columbia, as I mentioned before, is that we're a city where people want to come and live. We are a magnet for talent, and that's a good thing. We would much rather be a city where people want to live than where people don't want to live. We don't have enough housing, though, in the District of Columbia, and so we have basic economic problem. We've got too much demand for housing and not enough supply. And we need to make sure that we're thinking about that when we address our affordable housing and particularly our vulnerable citizens in the District of Columbia who are living in rental housing, oftentimes in deplorable conditions, and need to be mindful that if we think about how we're going to address housing in the city, we have to do two things. We have to protect the existing housing stock that we have by holding landlords accountable to following the law. We've got good rules and laws in the District of Columbia, a housing code that insists on a habitability and warmth and safe homes being provided. But too many landlords don't comply with the law. And some, worse than not complying, they actually affirmatively are neglecting the law because they're trying to force people out of their homes through a concept of constructive eviction. Because they recognize that going through the legal process of evicting is too long, too expensive, so they're forcing people out. The AG has to lean into that and prevent that. It's not only unlawful, it's an affront to the dignity of people who are living in their homes. It also undermines our ability to deal with our affordable housing crisis because we need to make sure that housing units stay habitable. We also have to be a community that is receptive to building and growing and developing. We need more housing units in Ward 3 and across the city, because that's the only way we're going to be able to have confront the issue of a lack of supply. As AG, I'm going to make sure that when we do have developers come in, that those developers are not corrupt, they're not disregarding the law, but they're living up to what they commit to do. Sustainability commitments, making sure that people who have lived in their neighborhoods are not displaced, and that we think about building out while not displacing, because that way together we can deal with the housing crisis and the affordability issue.
Thank you very much. Ms. McDuffie, the same question goes to you.
I'm going to try to keep my answer brief. I keep running up against the clock on these areas. I'm so passionate about this stuff, so I appreciate it.
And
We need to do.
not to make me use my teacher voice.
I appreciate it, Dave. We need to make sure that as we face a wave of evictions, that the Attorney General's office is a place where tenants understand that they're going to have somebody who's a champion for their issues, who's a champion for their causes, somebody who's going to hold landlords accountable for not unjustly evicting anyone, right? Working with the council and the mayor to make sure the resources in place so that landlords who do try to engage in those types of actions are held accountable, and making sure that the attorneys in the Attorney General's office have all the resources and tools that they need to act to thwart any attempts to unjustly evict tenants across the District of Columbia. Housing is one of the most pressing issues here in the District of Columbia. We're facing a housing affordability crisis, and we have been for some time. And the tools that are in place are important for keeping people in their homes, but working with the council to make sure that the laws meet the needs and the circumstances is also something that's important, and also something that the Attorney General's office can do. If there are any gaps that exist in today's law that need to be changed, the Attorney General can introduce legislation through the council chair, just as the mayor can. And as the next Attorney General, I would make sure that I would do that to make sure that it would close any gaps that existed there. We need to get DCRA, though, to make sure they're stepping up to enforce housing code violations that exist as well, and to push them to use the tools that we already have in our toolkit, right? The law is a tool to be utilized to keep people accountable. And as the next Attorney General, when it comes to housing, especially today, as we're coming out of this pandemic, I'm going to make sure that we're doing just that.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
I've cut my teeth on both sides of the law and landlord-tenant, representing landlords, representing tenants. This is a very interesting conundrum that we have in our hands. And so there needs to be a balanced effort. Are we talking about extending the moratorium by creating a succession plan so that people who are property owners can get the benefit of their property as they face financial harm as well? There are renters who need to stay in place. They have jobs to overcome what they haven't been able to pay in rent. These are real problems. This isn't something that we can sit up here, the four of us, and debate about and think that we're going to fix it today. I'm going to have to talk to my colleagues. I'm going to have to talk to each one of you to figure out what is best. Got a real critical issue with housing in this free market, which is Washington, D.C., because 1/3 is foreign investment. They're going all cash to buy property. That buoys the market. That's pushing people out who have regular jobs that can't compete with the richest people around the world because it's protecting their money here. This is a national problem that isn't germane or specific to Washington, D.C. So we need thought leaders from around the country. We need studies to tell us what is best. How are we going to protect historic residents? I talk about revitalizing the property tax code so that old or historic residents aren't being burdened by property tax increasing on them so viciously because someone else is creating a more valuable property next door. That's pushing folks out. That isn't a landlord-tenant issue and saying, hey, how do we keep renters in place? But this is something that's real, and I'm incorporating it here. We talk about zoning laws. How are we going to zone so we can put affordable units in place, right? We have to think about it in a new way, in a new fashion, so that when people do come into these affordable units, they can actually enjoy the equity that they put into these properties so that they can build wealth in generations. So that we're not talking about these problems in years to come. But this is a massive problem that we need to resolve, and it's not going to be easy.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Spiva.
Thank you. Like a lot of these issues, if you want to know what I'll do, look at what I've been doing for the last 30 years. I told you about the Columbia Heights case where I fought for low-income residents who were pushed out of their housing by slumlords and the district itself. So actually, the lawsuit was defended by the office that I'm now seeking to lead. But I will use that as a tool to try to preserve affordable housing, trying to stop those types of practices. I've also fought for public housing residents, African-American public housing residents who were segregated into poor conditions in public housing. And as a result of our lawsuit, we got a 10-year consent order, which required that the government provide housing vouchers, which allowed those residents to move to neighborhoods of their choice, and millions of dollars to try to improve the public housing for those who needed to stay. So that's my mindset. It's in my DNA to be on that side of the fight. There are some concrete things we can do despite the market pressures that my colleagues have spoken about. Going after slumlords, we need to use the housing code for tenants in those instances, though. So if we need to put those landlords into receivership, make the repairs, and if we have to, force the landlords, the slumlords, to sell the building, not throw the tenants out. We need to hold developers to the promises they make in exchange for city money to create a certain amount of affordable housing. We also need to ask the council to make affordable housing truly affordable, because too much of it actually is only affordable by people we used to would have called upper middle class folks. We need to use the zoning laws to create more affordable housing. And we also need to think about something else. At a recent forum, there was a young man who said that he had lost, his family had lost their family home because they couldn't afford the taxes anymore because the prices had gone up so much. And that's a story that's going on all over the city. We need to find some kind of solution so that those folks can enjoy the benefit of the increase in market values that we've seen in our market. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I want each of you to take on the flip side of that question and talk a little bit about landlord rights. What are the landlord's rights in this current situation, and what should they be, do you believe? Next, Attorney General. So I will start off first with you, Mr. Jones, because you actually mentioned landlords in your answer. So.
Right. Being on both sides of it, I know that landlords are having a hard time as well. They have to meet their responsibility of paying a mortgage off. And they're putting off bills and they're dealing with the hardship. And are they going to be able to enjoy the benefit of owning a property and having a renter in their property that they own? This is not something I can really elaborate on because the harshness is really felt by renters far more. We're talking about homelessness ramping up, and I don't know that you go from being evicted to an encampment, but do you go to some stable housing? What do you have as another option? And we have to sit here and say, look, things are broken. We're going to have to give people some grace, period. There's going to have to be a lot of money infused on both ends. And that's the only solution that I can think of in this moment. But that's something that we have to really consider.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Mr. Schwab, I'm going to pivot to you. Can you talk a little bit about landlord's rights?
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's so critical that when we're deciding who our next Attorney General is, somebody who has seen lots of different issues from lots of different perspectives. detectives, which is what I've been doing for the last 30 years of my life, trying cases and handling all sorts of different matters and seeing that every legal challenge, every fundamental issue we have where people disagree, there are always multiple points of view, often strongly held points of view. Another piece of advice my dad gave me was we all have to learn how to disagree without being disagreeable. And that's what you have to do as AG. You have to bring people together. You have to understand different issues. From the landlord perspective, my view is the law has to be enforced, which means landlords who are playing by the rules, it's an expensive jurisdiction to own property in. You pay taxes, you comply with the housing code, which can often put an additional burden on businesses. The law has to be held, everybody has to be held accountable to follow the law, because landlords who are doing the work and are complying with the law are at a competitive disadvantage if others cheat and the law doesn't hold them accountable. And that's across the board in our city. Small businesses and entrepreneurs who are every day playing by the rules and seeing others going front of the line or cheating or participating in a pay-to-play culture where the laws are not fairly enforced across the board. An independent attorney general has to make sure we have a level playing field where everybody plays by the rules. And landlords have to know, and the investment committee has to know, that when they do invest in the District of Columbia, the rules will apply. If we don't have that, people will not come to the city and invest, and we don't want to be a city that people run away from investment.
Thank you very much. Mr. Spivey, I'm going to put it to you.
Okay, thanks. I do think it's important that we not demonize all landlords, because it is difficult, I think, for some, particularly small property landlords. It can be a source of generational wealth. And so I agree with my colleague that where people are playing by the rules, keeping up their property, that they have a right to a reasonable profit from their property. I think oftentimes in landlord-tenant court, there's a great imbalance because one of the greatest predictors of whether a tenant is going to be evicted is whether they have a lawyer. The landlords almost always have a lawyer. The tenants almost always do not. And so that's why it's so important. I know the organization that I was on the board of, we pushed to get more pro bono lawyers in landlord housing court, and we're able to do that. But I think I do think that the other thing is we shouldn't think of essentially this is a special source of taxing. Some of these issues are going to require citywide effort and putting money towards, either supplementing income or providing additional affordable housing. And so we shouldn't just think of, kind of landlords as a special class that we can kind of put extra taxes on.
Thank you, Mr. Spivey. Mr. Mcduffie.
Thank you for the question, Dean. In short, landlords deserve a system that is fair and just like tenants, and that the laws are enforced evenly. But here's the reality, that when you go to landlord-tenant court, what used to be the case was that 90% of landlords came to landlord-tenant court with a lawyer, which had outcomes that were disproportionately stacked against tenants. So I didn't just sit around and pontificate about it. I actually took action. I called a roundtable as the chair of the Committee on Judiciary and Public Safety, and I didn't do it at the Wilson Building. I did it right here with one of the top clinic programs in the country, with thought leaders from around the city. And I called it a civil Gideon, access to justice, and expanding justice in the District of Columbia. And as a result of those roundtables and conferring with those experts in testimony, it resulted in the expanding access to justice law that is on the books today that funds lawyers for tenants in landlord-tenant court. So if you want an attorney general who has a track record of actually taking action to deal with these issues that we're talking about today, that's not just speaking prospectively, but actually has a record of doing things to address these issues, then there's only one person sitting up here today who's qualified to talk about it that way and actually qualified to take action as attorney general.
Thank you, Mr. Mcduffie. So with about 18 minutes left, 3 questions to go. I'm going to ask you now about priority. just to give you a heads up of the queue, Mr. Spiva, I'm going to go to you first. Mr. Schwab, you're second. Mr. Mcduffie, you're going to be third. Mr. Jones, you're going to be last. I'm going to ask you a little bit about priorities. So of the programs and offices that current Attorney General Racine has added to the Office of Attorney General, which we keep or expand, and which we cut and why?
Yeah, I don't know that I can say that I would cut any particular program that the current Attorney General has added. There are many that he has that I would look to expand, such as the violence interruption program and restorative justice programs. I think that a number of the ideas he's had on housing. My priorities as Attorney General, I mean, it's a massive office with 11 divisions that covers everything from antitrust and consumer protection, civil rights, child support. And I would like to focus on all of them, but primarily first housing justice, a lot of the issues we just talked about, because we do have a housing crisis that touches on every other challenge that we have, including criminal justice reform, and trying to make us more safe and make us more fair. I think they do go together. Workers' rights and consumer rights, and on the workers' rights issue, we haven't had that much time to talk about it tonight, but there are a lot of unscrupulous employers in the city who don't pay their workers what they are lawfully required. And I'm the one here who has done that kind of work. I've represented labor unions. I've represented consumers in class actions and antitrust matters. And so I'll go after those types of unscrupulous employers. It's a matter of fairness and frankly, an anti-poverty program for the workers, but it's also good for the businesses that are abiding by the law. We're getting undercut by these unscrupulous businesses that are cheating their workers. So those would be the types of priorities. There's some that are less talked about, like child support. Again, very important function for the office, and I think it could be improved significantly. And that's an anti-poverty program. We need to get in place appropriate child support orders for the kids.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schwab.
Well, I happen to think that what AG Racine has done in terms of building out the office and making it one of the premier attorney general offices in the country is something we all have to be proud of and something we should be building upon. It is important for us in terms of residents in the city towards our administration of justice. As we march to being a state, Exhibit A is the extraordinarily talented AG office we have. So I don't like the idea of taking away. I like the idea of building on and prioritizing. One area that I'm going to lean into and prioritize is in the consumer protection front. Going to get the light. Keep the lights paid. Let me regather my thoughts there.
Okay.
I paused. Don't worry, I paused.
You're not getting light.
You're good.
You know, with consumer protection right now, what I want to make sure every time we lean into a consumer protection issue is we can answer the question, how does this help the residents who live in the District of Columbia? Certain nationwide consumer protection cases that have been brought are clearly helping the people who live in the District of Columbia, and they're important to continue. But we have some folks who are living in the District of Columbia who are facing scams, price gouging, terrible situations where the consumer protection work of the office needs to be beefed up. I'm thinking about people who are confronting the fact that there are scam artists and telemarketers who are calling them every day, telling them, you got a tax lien on your house. You better sell your house before you lose it. Or people who come in and say, I'll buy your house because your property is, you're going to lose your property. Let me give you an appraisal on it. And the appraiser is in cahoots with the group that's going to come behind it and buy the house. So the appraiser comes in and undermines what the value is. Or the inspector that's in cahoots that comes in and says, you got a whole bunch of work you need to do on your house. Your house isn't worth as much as you think it is. And what happens is those people come in and they flip that house immediately. That's affecting people every day. It's taking their homes away, a lot of the equity that their families have had over time. That's a consumer protection violation. It's illegal. It's an affront to what any of us should think is right. And so that's a place where, as Attorney General, I'm going to lean into beefing up the consumer protection work that helps people who live in the district.
Sure. Public safety, consumer protection, wage theft, environmental justice. Public safety, particularly when it comes to the violence interruption work, is something that I think is on the right trajectory, and then I would look to beef up, and I would bring a degree of experience that's different from any other candidate. And so I would look to do that. And that's a top issue that I hear from voters is how to keep us safe. Consumer protection, there are a lot of high-profile cases that are going on right now, but when I knock on doors, as I've done over the course of this campaign, what residents are talking about are the senior citizens who are being preyed upon by scam artists who are looking to take their houses, like I just mentioned, but also from contractors who are coming in with senior citizens on a fixed income who are looking to get their roof repaired, who get quoted a price, and when the work is done, they try to charge them 5 times the amount. We're going to be going after them if I'm the Attorney General. We're going to make sure that we address environmental justice issues, which is a huge issue that does not get the sort of attention that it deserves. When I go in communities like Brentwood and Ivy City, and you see residents struggling to breathe clean air, clean air is a right that everybody should have. And not enough people understand the role of the Attorney General in making sure we enforce those environmental justice laws. And I've been working with Carl Racine in this office today with Environmental Justice Task Force that I established just a couple of months ago. So public safety, consumer protection, environmental justice, and wage theft. There are far too many companies who aren't paying their fair wages to their workers. In fact, they're cheating the city and they're cheating those workers and their families. And that's going to be a priority for me as the next Attorney General.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones.
Yeah, so I embarked on this journey in order to create a course correction for our government so that we can all live in a brighter day. And I talk about equal access to justice. I believe in the court system. I believe what lawyers do. And the Attorney General has an ability to create an office that does just that. I talk about my priorities. I start with creating a task force that teams with the ACLU, the Justice Round Table, and you go through the entirety of the DC Code. You revise it, you revitalize it, you amend laws that need to be amended so that we have laws that are equitable on our books so that we can start talking about resolving all of the other issues that we're talking about here today. How we get access to justice, how do people get into the courts? I want to create an expungement clinic, team with outside counsel so that people go right into DC Superior Court, get their records expunged so that they can go out and get jobs, so that they're not participating in the crime that we see them participating in as a way to make ends meet. I talk about creating wealth for people, generations. So we need to have a wills and trust clinic right inside of DC Superior Court, right next to the expungement clinic. That's equal access to justice. That's what it looks like. Here with outside counsel, they go and they start creating your wills and your trusts and allow people to establish wealth and pass down their property and know how to actually, pass these on so that their children aren't hampered with, properties that they don't know how to manage or take care of. Lastly, I want to expand public advocacy. I want to do that with infusing angel litigation funding into that program that allows other folks to take on cases that deter bad actors from engaging in whatever the act may be. And then we can see better behavior because they know that they can't get away with those types of things here in the district with me as the Attorney General. Then we can start seeing the resolution of violence in education and housing and other environmental issues.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. So our last 2 questions are going to focus on an issue that you've all raised, wage theft, and the final question is going to focus on racial equity. With regard to the question on wage theft, Mr. Gunning, you first, and I'm going to ask you what steps you would take toward eliminating all forms of wage theft, fostering an environment for protection in the district if you become the next year.
That's a great question, and frankly, something that I don't think gets talked about enough, either through the course of this campaign or generally speaking. Wage theft is a huge issue in the District of Columbia and across the nation. In fact, I was proud as chair of the Committee on Government Operations to work to put more resources within the Office of Wage Theft. And I frankly appreciate the way that Carl Racine has really stepped up the efforts around wage theft. And my colleague, Melissa Silverman, who chairs our Committee on Workforce and Jobs, has really made sure that we are prioritizing wage theft. I mentioned it in the answer because it is something that is a priority for me throughout the course of this campaign and will be a priority for me as Attorney General. But part of it is also making sure that the relationship that exists between the office and the Office of Wage Theft within the Department of Employment Services is a strong relationship. But then you have to make sure that that relationship is extended to the community, where workers, in many instances, are afraid to come forward to talk about what their bosses are doing to them on a regular basis, which is why you need a community-facing Attorney General's office, so that people are aware of their rights and aware that they have a champion within the office of the Attorney General who's going to fight for them. I'm running to be the people's lawyer so that every worker across our city, regardless of their income, understands that nobody should steal from them. And when you steal from our workers, you steal from our city. And so I'm going to prioritize that issue to make sure that workers, whether it's in the construction industry or whether it's in the retail industry or what have you, understand that there's an office within the Attorney General's office who's going to prioritize their rights and work with them to hold people accountable who steal from them.
Thank you very much, Mr. McDuffie. Mr. Jones.
I'll harken back to my public advocacy arm of my plan, which then could attack wage theft. Wage theft is ramping up, as we all know. Why is that happening? COVID has exacerbated this in a time when the 9 to 5 has been obliterated. What does wage theft actually look like? You're now working hours early and late, and you're not being compensated for that. Employers are now facing the requirement for more leave and things of that nature. People are skimping as they're on certain costs, trying to survive in an environment where a lot of businesses have been put out of business. Excuse me. And so there is an interesting dynamic at play. So we recognize that workers need to be compensated fairly for the work that they put in. We're recognizing in these days we have people working multiple jobs and doing something in what we call now the gig economy, and how they're being, how their benefits are flowing to them if they do become, W-9 workers. And so this is an interesting conundrum. However, you work through it and you go and step out on behalf of certain employers that you know are abusing the system, and you take them right to court. That's what the AG would do. And you deter other large employers, small employers, wherever they may be, from acting that way in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schwab.
Well, I'm very proud that the carpenters, the iron workers, the plumbers, the pipe fitters have all endorsed my campaign and endorsed me. And when I talk to the union workers about this critical issue about wage theft, the reason why they're behind me is I started my career at the tax division enforcing the very types of laws that we're talking about in terms of making sure that employers aren't taking advantage of employees, because the scams of treating employees as independent contractors to avoid having to pay benefits, of not paying full wages to avoid paying taxes, not paying overtime or benefits, are the kind of cases I tried when I was first at the Justice Department many years ago and tried them all over the country. And when I talk to the unions about how we're going to build those cases, they understand that with me as their AG, they've got somebody who will be a fierce advocate for building the cases, for working with the witnesses, for knowing how the cases are built and then effectively tried. We have a big problem with wage theft. Our construction industry is part of it, but it's all across the city. But there's an even deeper problem that I plan to get to, which is we've got labor brokers. We've got human trafficking in the labor space happening, where workers are being trafficked to the District of Columbia from North Carolina or Virginia. And the people who are doing it find it cheaper to put them up in hotels than to pay them what they're fully due. We have to be a city that leans into that with an AG who understands how to aggressively go after wage theft and the issues associated with human trafficking, build cases, and do them the right way. So we send a message that that's not going to happen in our city. We know it's totally corrosive, not only to our tax base, to our unemployment, workers' comp base, it's also, to the point I made earlier, totally unfair to the level playing field that we should have in the District of Columbia. One of the reasons it's so hard for unions to win bids is because there are non-labor organized contractors that come in and undercut because it's on the back of their workers. And when we can have labor unions playing on a level playing field, they're going to win bids. And DC residents who are labor members and our workers are going to be doing jobs in the District of Columbia as opposed to losing that work to non-DC companies.
Thank you very much. Mr. Spiva.
Thanks again. Here again is an area where you can kind of look at what I have done and you'll know what I will do. I formed my own firm where I successfully brought many plaintiff side class actions on behalf of everyday people, oftentimes district residents. I fought big oil. I successfully fought an internet service provider, so big tech. for overcharging consumers. And oftentimes in the wage theft area, what happens is workers are misclassified as either independent contractors or as management, and then they're cheated out of their wages. These are complicated cases. They're difficult to win. And so it's important that you have someone who has a mindset and has actually done this before and actually put together these types of complex cases, who's been the David. So I've been on the plaintiff side of these cases, as opposed to having been a corporate defense attorney, who's been the David against the Goliath in these battles. And I take this very seriously. I think it is a matter first of an anti-poverty program and a moral issue for workers, but also for those scrupulous businesses. I was at dinner and a woman-owned business, a woman who owned her own business, came up to me and without me saying a word said, "You've got to do something about wage theft because I'm getting undercut by businesses that are cheating their workers and I'm losing contracts because of that." And I think that's not good for scrupulous business people, and it's bad for the workers first and foremost. And so that I will be a fierce advocate in terms of fighting that as your Attorney General. And I've done it before and won.
Thank you very much for describing that.
Yes.
You already.
Well, yeah, I want to correct something. I said W-9. It should have been W-2 versus 1099. I saw Brenda laughing at me like, look, right, cut that out. Thank you, Brenda. It's good. It's good. I'm glad you did outside. I felt the heat in my
So my final question is the question of racial equity. The executive and legislative branches of the DC government both have offices of racial equity. I would like each of you to please explain your understanding of racial equity and to talk about how, as Attorney General, you plan to ensure that racial equity will be incorporated into all of your priorities as the Attorney General. And on this one, Mr. Jones, I'm going to go to you first.
Thank you. So racial equity and the Racial Equity Office is supposed to be reviewing the laws established by council. Okay, are these laws that being as they're going to be enacted going to ensure that it's not going to have a desperate impact on certain communities? Now, the people that are doing the work are going to be the most critical components of that office. So, hiring matters. Who actually has the lens for racial justice, equality, to see the way the laws are written and how they'll be played out in action matter the most. And so you have to put the right people in place. To just have the title, to say that it's there, you have to dig a little bit deeper. You have to say, who are the people that are in that office doing the work? And do they have that moral compass to ensure that racial equity will be achieved in our laws going forward? Talk about my task force, teaming with the ACLU in order to achieve that end. And that means that's going to be a double layer almost for the laws that are enacted and even the regulations that are promulgated. We need to look at them all and see how agencies can enforce them and have their resources allocated to residents that need it the most. And so that's my understanding of what the Racial Equity Office is doing and my perspective on how the OEG's office will be overseeing it, put into place.
Thank you very much. Mr. Mcduffie.
So I actually authored the Racial Equity Achieve Results Act here in the District of Columbia. I work with the coalition of organizations and individuals to do that. I authored it in January of 2019 and it passed and I funded it with the support of my colleagues in 2020. In fact, I started that work before the stories were dominating the headlines after the horrific killing of George Floyd. And I did it years before that because I know how much it matters here in the District of Columbia, where we have one of the largest racial wealth gaps of any city in the United States, where we have one of the most racially segregated housing markets of any city in the United States. I started out today's forum by saying that I'm running to make sure that justice, opportunity, and equity reaches every individual across our city. Equity is not just a buzzword. It makes that people get what they need to thrive in our society. And when you have a nearly $20 billion budget, it means we got a long way to go because there's far too many people with unmet needs. I've already said publicly, when elected Attorney General, I'm going to have a chief equity officer in my office. Just like the REACH Act established a council office of racial equity and an office of racial equity in the mayor's office with chief equity officers for the executive and for the council. Because in our society, there are far too many people who do not know what justice looks like. And this isn't an exercise in theory for me. I grew up in some of the toughest times in our city's history in the 80s and 90s. I was arrested in my neighborhood for doing nothing more than being a young Black man walking up the aisle. So I know what injustice looks like, but I also know what justice looks like as a former prosecutor and a civil rights trial attorney in the Department of Justice. And so when you hear me use the word equity, you can believe that I mean it because I have a track record of delivering equity here in this city.
Thank you, Mr. Mcduffie. Mr. Spiva.
Thank you. I think you first asked, what does racial equity mean to me? And I think there are a couple of components. I mean, our law, unfortunately, the history of our country is infused with racial inequity. Right? I mean, for every Brown, there's a Dred Scott and Plessy versus Ferguson. And we suffer today still from the after effects of redlining that created inequities, racial inequities among our segregated neighborhoods. And I personally also have experienced this, not only through hearing the stories of my parents, but also, frankly, by being called the N-word by people that I thought were my friend when I was growing up. When I was growing up, we were just a few years down the road from the Public Accommodations Act and the Fair Housing Act and the rest. And so we were very much living with the after effects of that. I think there's also a component within the office of making sure you have a diverse workforce and different perspectives and different racial backgrounds. I think sometimes we too often create an office. We try to put this problem into an office. We have a chief diversity officer. A lot of law firms are doing this. To some extent, we've done it within the district government. And I think sometimes that makes it too easy to say, okay, we've got that problem solved. We've got somebody whose job it is to think about this, and we think we've done something. I think what you really need to do is make sure that you set a standard and that is everybody's responsibility. It's infused throughout the organization, and you create benchmarks and you follow up with them and make sure that people are making it part of the success metric of the office. And that's what I'll do as Attorney General.
Thank you very much.
Well, as I said at the beginning, I think the greatest threat we have to our future as Washingtonians is this widening gulf that we have between how opportunity and equity and income is shared. And when you look at where that gulf is split, it's along racial lines. And that's due to the history of our country and the history of our city. I think as Mayor Pratt was alluding to, some of the history that doesn't make us so proud of what our city was like. We got to talk honestly about that. We got to recognize that that's the foundation we're working on. But every day an Attorney General's office who's focused on racial equity will be putting the law to work to address how do we narrow that gap. So here's an example. We know that too many people are not able to build intergenerational wealth by buying a home or building a business because there are barriers to entry for credit, for insurance that are now being driven by machine learning, algorithm, artificial intelligence, the garbage in, garbage out. The modern day redlining is happening without human beings discriminating, but systems being in place that keep too often Black families from buying their first home or Black entrepreneurs from getting the credit and the insurance that they need to be successful. And AG's got to lean into that and figure out how do we tackle that right now. Those are really difficult, hard cases that require lawyers who have spent their lives working hard to solve really hard problems by putting the law to work to get results. And candidly, results are what matter when we're talking about racial equity. Not talking about it, but doing something about it. when we're talking about who's disproportionately impacted when we have a rising real estate market and who are the scammers going after, it's too often Black families, second, third generation owning their homes, who are losing their homes to scams. When the law leans into that, when the AG does something that we narrow the gap. So I think it's about using the law every day to narrow the equity gap, which too often in our city and in our country, when we're being honest, is a gap that divides because of our terrible history with systemic racism.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schwab. And with that, we have come to the end of our Q&A, and it is now time to turn to closing statements. So to remind you of the order, we are taking the reverse order from the way we began. And so, Mr. Spiva, you will begin. Mr. Jones, you will follow. Mr. Schwab, you will follow. And Mr. Mcduffie, you will close us out. Mr. Spiva.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us here tonight and for this great forum. A great Washingtonian, Frederick Douglass, once said that power concedes nothing without a demand. And I believe that when we see an injustice, we must never walk away. We have a moral obligation to try to change it. And that is the reason that we were put on this earth. And that is the reason why I want to be your next Attorney General. I will wake up every morning thinking about how I can make positive change for everyday people's lives. I want to fight for housing justice, fighting slumlords and increasing affordable and habitable housing. I want to fight for criminal justice reform and violence interruption. I want to fight for civil rights and workers' rights, consumer protection, and environmental justice. Now, these are not issues that just came along to me in this election season. These are the types of issues I've been fighting for the last 30 years. The last 30 years when my clients had nobody else to turn to, when other lawyers were too worried about how they would get paid to pay them in mind, I was there in their corner fighting to try to help them achieve justice. When their voices were not heard, I went into court working with them to try to lift up their voices and help them tell their stories. I'm going to be an Attorney General who uses the power of the office to fight for those who have been left out and left behind. I can assure you that I will not be afraid to shake things up. I will be fiercely independent. I'll be creative and persistent in the use of the powers of the office to help the people. So if you want a leader who is best prepared based on the types of things I've been doing for the last 30 years to lead an office, to make positive change, I urge you to support me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Spiva. Mr. Jones.
I don't have a prepared closing, but I do want to say a couple things. I took over a program for a business community membership organization. And when I took over that program, they said about me publicly, large email to everybody, he knows nothing. That's what they said about me. Then I went and outperformed my predecessor. That's what I did because I knew I had to. I represent 3% of the legal profession as an African American. Talk about racial equity. That's why I'm running. All right. I watched what happened in 2020. It's despicable. We're watching things exacerbate, get worse. Vote for racial. You want to vote for racial equity? You vote for me. The idea is that I, as an attorney, I'm always guided by the rules of professional responsibility. I think I'm a better attorney than Ryan, Bruce, or Kenyon, and I can't say that. So the answer is no. I'm asking you guys to believe in me because of why I started this. No one popped me up. No one put me here. I've been through it on this campaign trail in ways you guys would never know. And I'd be happy to tell you if you want to sit down. This has been a life-changing experience for me. And I want to get to June 21st on the other side, a better man with more friends and more people that like me and understand and respect my mind. Because I'm tired of waking up in a world where I'm considered less than. And I have to keep trying extra hard just to prove that I'm the same. And the truth is, if I really want to talk some stuff, I might be better than. But I can't say that. We can't say that. It's going to come a time and day when you see each other as equals. And I relish that day. And that's why I'm running. I want to be considered one of my colleagues, and it's not worried about my age, my skin color, my religion, my place of origin, or any of that. And I don't want anyone else to have to worry about that. Thank you.
Mr. Schwab.
I just want to say I love Brian.
I've already told him that. In public, in front of everyone. Like, we're making a really, really important decision as DC residents as to who our next AG is going to be. We got a lot of really important, difficult issues to deal with, and we have huge promise. And I think that making the decision about who our next AG is a little bit like choosing a doctor when you have somebody in your family that you love who's facing a very difficult illness. My wife and I confronted that when our girls were very, very young, 5, 3, and 18 months. My wife, Mickey, was diagnosed with what we thought was an incurable form of blood cancer. And thank goodness we had insurance and we were able to bring doctors together and figure out how to beat that back. But I remember what we asked when we were trying to figure out what to do. We said, do we have a trusted referral? Who do we call who we trust to figure out what we do? Well, everybody in the District of Columbia has somebody who they can trust. That's Carl Racine. Carl Racine, who has been our first elected Attorney General, who has built this office into an excellent, extraordinary office through leadership by bringing great talent that has lots of opportunities to do lots of things to work for us in the District of Columbia, who has built this office out to fighting for cutting edge issues on the national stage, fighting for our democracy across the country and for people who live here. Carl Racine is a trusted source, and he's told you who he thinks the next Attorney General should be. And he said it's not even close. Irv Nathan, who was the Attorney General before Carl, who was also an extraordinary member of our community, who knows what it takes to do this job, has told you who he thinks should be the next Attorney General. When we were trying to decide who we should pick as a doctor, I wanted to know, what was your track record? How many cases have you tried? How many patients have you treated? I'm bringing 30 years of experience trying cases every day, from death penalty cases to billion-dollar civil cases. I've led a large law office. The Attorney General's office has 700 plus full-time equivalents. It's a $150 million budget. It's not something you turn over to someone who hasn't been engaged in the leadership. And lastly, I'm independent. I'm not a politician. I'm not afraid to shake things up. I'm bringing a fresh perspective, and I'm going to come in. I'm going to make sure we get results, because all of us who live here and pay taxes deserve results.
Thank you, Mr. Schwab. Ms. Mcduffie.
You can tell a lot about people from the choices that they've made in their lives. You can tell a lot about candidates from the choices that they've made in their lives. What you can tell about me is that I care about you, because I've dedicated my career to public service. Over the course of this campaign, you will continue to hear people talk about what they want to do. They'll make promises of all sorts. You heard them talking about racial equity today, restorative justice today. You heard them talking about wage theft today. Well, I'm the only one who's sitting here who's actually done something about those things already. You don't learn about public safety by watching the 6 o'clock news. You learn about public safety by being out there with people who experience violence. And I've been out there with those people. I've been out there with the violence interrupters. I've been out there after the shots have been fired. I've seen the yellow tape. I've seen the bloodstained streets. And I've heard the shots myself. Not simply as a council member, but as somebody growing up in this city. It's why I chose to serve. When I finished law school, I could have went and got a job on K Street, but I chose to serve. You all have a choice to make. And although everybody sits up here talking about justice, some folks use the law to keep you all from deciding who's best qualified to be your attorney general. But I think you all are smarter than that. And I put my faith in you every single day of the week. And at the end of the day, I have confidence that you all know who's best qualified and who's already demonstrated who's committed to you.
Thank you. So before I hand it over to Karen to close us out, I want to ask you to join me in thanking the 4 candidates for joining us. University of the District of Columbia, and on behalf of the People's Law School, my institution, UDC Law, I want to thank you for coming out tonight, and I want to ask you to have safe travel home.
Take a minute to thank all of the people that really helped make this a success. Thanks to you, the UDC team. I was not supposed to use acronyms, but Lee, Brian, Revon, and Dean Hutchins and Mayor Pratt, as well as the audiovisual people who are no longer here, but our audiovisual team and Zoom team, etc. Ingrid Atkin and Mary Ellen Golchuk. Tompkins, Samira Daniels, Elizabeth Mitchell, and then from Ward 4, we have Candace Nelson, Vanessa Rubio, Lawrence Miner, Tiffany Nicole Johnson. Really